come back together, and I want to introduce our moderator for this session, Sue Fishkop. She's the editor of J Weekly. She's written for a wide variety of publications and is the author of 2 books, The Rebbe's Army and Kosher Nation. And I'd now like to turn the discussion over to Sue.
Thank you, everybody. I hope you are enjoying this summit as much as I am. And this morning's conversation was particularly illuminating, I thought. The emphasis on tachlis was really important in a group like this. Our session, as California goes, so goes the nation. The only problem I have with that title is the question mark at the end of it. You know, let's take off that question mark, and we all know that as in everything else from food to environmental activism to same-sex marriage, you know, as it is in California, so that is true in Jewish life. Jewish life, Jewish community here, the way Jews relate to their Judaism, their history, their future is very different. You know, as a transplant from New York who has worked on both coasts and many places in between, I can attest to that. But we can sit here as Californians, most of us in this room live in California, not all of us. We can sit here and congratulate ourselves on that, or we can talk honestly about what is different, what isn't different, and what it means to us as individual Jews and as members of Jewish organizations. How does California's regionalism, our cultural difference here, the fact that we are a community, a state of pioneers, of dreamers, of people who have torn up their roots and come here to create their own reality. How does that play out in terms of Jews and their relationship to Judaism and Jews and their relationship to Israel? That's what we're here to discuss, and I want to introduce the 3 speakers from left to right, as so often happens in this organization. We have on the far left, we have Mark Dollinger, who is the Richard and Rhoda Goldman Chair of Jewish Studies and Social Responsibility at San Francisco State University. He's the author of several books on American Jewish history, including my personal favorite, California Jews, which he co-edited with Eva Kahn. And he's currently at work on a book that sounds fascinating to me, Is It Good for the Jews? Power, Politics, and the 1960s. He is currently serving as board president of Jewish Community High School of the Bay. He sits on the California Advisory Committee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. And according to him, he can't stop thinking about writing a book about Jimmy Carter. So good luck with that. And in the middle here is Rabbi Noah Kushner. She is the founding, call out, shout out. She's the founding rabbi of The Kitchen, a San Francisco nonprofit that describes itself as 1 part Shabbat Minyan, 1 part San Francisco Experiment, and 1 part do-it-yourself toolkit for Judaism. And that, ladies and gentlemen, pretty much sums up what we're talking about here today. She has her BA in Religious Studies from Brown. She was ordained by Hebrew Union College in New York, and she served as the Hillel Rabbi at Stanford before coming to her current position at The Kitchen. And to my immediate left is Daniel Sokach. He is CEO of the New Israel Fund. Before joining the New Israel Fund, he was executive director of the Jewish Federation here in San Francisco. And prior to that, he was the founding executive director of the Progressive Jewish Alliance in Los Angeles. That's one of 2 organizations that have merged and is now Bend the Arc. He was named to the Forward newspaper's Forward 50 list of top Jewish decision makers and opinion shapers 4 out of the past 12 years, which begs the question, what have you been doing the other 8 years?
And I've not yet been named by the judge, I'm just saying.
There's an opportunity there, a naming opportunity, I might say. So I'd like to turn it over to Mark Dolinger first. What am I doing here? We will hear from Professor Dolinger about some of the historical and contemporary trends that have made California such a driver of innovative Jewish life. And after he speaks, the other two panelists will have a chance to respond, and then we'll engage in conversation. So thank you, Mark.
We just celebrated Shavuot, the revelation of Torah at Sinai. But we're in San Francisco, so maybe not so much. Unless you happen to be with the kitchen that actually lit up the Mission District on Shavuot in ways that the city has actually never seen. We're going to get to innovation in a moment now. We go back into history to 1905, when members of Congregation Shearith Israel, which is located in that sort of direction over there, decided to commission a stained glass window for the new building that they were putting up on the corner of California and Webster Streets. And there you will see not just Shearith Israel's version of Revelation in Shavuot, but the state of California, I think, as well. Because there Moses delivers the Ten Commandments, but if you look closely into the background, especially for those of you who may not be members of Shearith Israel to see that every day, he is in fact not in the Sinai Desert of current-day Egypt. He is in the middle of Yosemite Valley, with El Capitan and Half Dome in the background, begging the question, since we do have the parents of the chief rabbi of Fresno here, is that where the golden calf was actually created in this California version of Revelation? And did it take them more than 40 years to get from the Central Valley of California up here to San Francisco to put up that window? I think it did. Good morning and welcome to a very different version of Jewish history, American Jewish history, and perhaps some antecedents to the innovation which is arising. So thank you, Sue, for removing the question mark. Is California different? Yes, I think that will be our collective answer today, not that surprising. It begins, from my perspective, with the Haskalah. This is the Jewish version of the Enlightenment, which began in the 18th century in Central and Western Europe, certainly moving into the 19th and Eastern Europe, even to the current day. My definition for the Jews, for the Enlightenment, is civil equality in a Christian-dominated society. That the goal would be, in modernity, for modern Jews to consider themselves fully modern. They need to achieve civil equality in a Christian-dominated society. This was a European-based idea that was created with the advent of what's called natural rights theory. So for those who are not philosophy majors in college, or perhaps attorneys now, natural rights theory was a radical notion that did not actually come from the Jews, that every single baby ever born was endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among them are life, liberty, and? Thank you, it's actually property, but we'll get to that in a moment. Life, liberty, and property. This particular idea of natural rights would end up having huge implications for the Jews and certainly for modern Judaism. Once the Enlightenment came to the West and came to the British North American colonies, and ultimately to what would be the United States of America, the Founding Fathers actually based our very Declaration of Independence on the natural rights theory. This is where the word property got turned into the pursuit of happiness, because Jefferson was a little concerned that you can't have a revolution against England while giving her a natural right to you as her property. So they needed to get rid of a natural right and come up with another one. The United States, more than almost any other time and place in Jewish history, offered its Jews a sense of equality. In fact, once the U.S. Constitution was ratified about 15 or so years later, the separation of church and state made it even better for the Jews in the United States. And dare I say it, in the U.S., California ended up even better than what would be the other 49 states. Here in San Francisco, the gold rush offered incredible opportunity to its first Jewish residents. Levi Strauss, probably the most famous of all of them. And Jews in this city were fully integrated with civil equality in a Christian-dominated society in the first generation, with all due respect to the New Yorkers who were here. It took to the second or third generation for Greater New York, and that includes New Jersey, to get the kind of equality that San Francisco Jews saw. For those of you, I know several of you are from LA, specifically the movie industry, starting in the 19-teens, but really in the 1920s, meant not only that Jews themselves enjoy a certain prominence in Los Angeles, but Jews ended up defining popular culture for non-Jews across the country. And that's a remarkable, remarkable innovation. And now my moment for the New Yorkers, okay, Irving Berlin, he was also had the same phenomenon as LA did. The most popular song ever recorded in US history, White Christmas. They also wrote Easter Parade. Jewish immigrant defining what Christianity is. That to me is civil equality in a Christian-dominated society. Why did this happen? The historiography, the history of why it is that we think this happened. First I'll give you the old and then the new, and then they're going to give you the really new. The old idea is that Jews were hardworking. And certainly I like to think that Jews are hardworking, but this argument fits into the Horatio Alger myth. All you need to do is sort of work hard, get a little bit of luck, and you too can be successful in America. We often hear that Jewish culture emphasizes education. Also a nice thing, also may be true. The implication is Jews are just smarter than non-Jews because, that's how we were raised. Jewish community structures offer support. And while we have had many alphabet soup agencies over time and place, one thing that we may engage with innovation is really the challenge that many of these, and one in particular, I guess, here in the J Street world, national organizations are trying to keep a cohesive sense of community together. I think the more relevant and the most recent historical research actually points to different reasons for these to happen, and maybe California can be focused of them. Number one, Jews are white. White as a sociological, not a biological characterization, and white even understanding that more and more these days Jews are actually much more racially diverse. That said, in San Francisco, the Jews did very well, and you can say all the wonderful things you like about California and opportunity, as long as you don't come from China or Japan. Because the experience of Chinese and Japanese immigrants to this city and to this state was horrendous. So the notion and depiction of California as a promised land or as a place of innovation, to me, is racially based, and it's only racially based if the Jews end up on the white side of that particular continuum. And an interesting Zionist side note, in World War II, the internment of US citizens of Japanese descent, I should say, the incarceration, that's the new word in the historical field, the incarceration of US citizens of Japanese descent was supported by organized Jewry, with the exception, the public exception, only of San Francisco rabbis, who were also anti-Zionists. And there's a connection. If you have a question on that, I'll do it during Q&A on how that happened. So number one, Jews succeeded in California, and they were able to do innovation because they were white. Number two, Jews arrived on the first day of the city, as it were, or at least the first day of a new power structure in the city. In most other times and places in Jewish history in the diaspora, Jews arrive in a place that another group has control, and they have to mediate for control. It really, really helps to get here on day one. And third, because they were white, because they got here on day one, they enjoyed social acceptance. They could go to any schools they wanted, any clubs they wanted, hang out, buy houses, and once that happens, they're able to power themselves up the social mobility ladder. And it's very good for the Jews because, in our state at least, going to the university is pretty much a done deal. If you want to do that, going to graduate school, almost as well. But there is the bad and the ugly of this particular phenomenon. The first, voluntaristic Judaism. Since the Haskalah, since the Enlightenment, since Jews achieved civil equality in a Christian-dominated society, everybody, we say, is a Jew by choice. Milton Gordon in 1964 wrote a book called Assimilation in American Life. He talked about the 7 steps to becoming a real American. The 7th, last, most difficult, challenging step he called structural assimilation, which was intermarriage. To be gendered about it, they may say they like you, but would they let you marry their daughter? Only when they let you marry their daughter do you know you've made it in that society. Therefore, the sign of success of the Enlightenment, the Haskalah for modern Jews to have what we have always wanted, is 100% intermarriage. So at the same time that the organized Jewish community laments intermarriage, They may not be so aware they're lamenting their own equality. In Marin County, where I live, intermarriage rates are 75%, which is artificially low because if you do by age, it's actually 90% for families with school-aged children. So in California, especially in the Bay Area, especially in the North Bay, so much. Synagogue affiliation, Rabbi Kushner knows this. Las Vegas, Nevada claimed the lowest synagogue affiliation rate at 14%, according to the data. It's actually not. It's Sonoma County, California, at 10%. But Daniel, we'll go back to your federation days. Since it's one piece of the federation of this region, the numbers didn't get pulled out separately. So we in the Bay Area and in California are known nationally as a spiritual kind of people. We are clearly not an organized religion kind of people, and I think that is calling and screaming for innovation. And Zionism, at least in this town, has been mixed as well. We were in the 19th century the center for right-leaning Jewish anti-Zionism, and in the 21st century we are the center of left-leaning Jewish anti-Zionism, and I think both phenomenons are occurring here, and particularly here, for their own reasons. So this, I think, begs the larger question, given this reality, given the incredible opportunity and gifts that California Jews have received, against the incredible challenges that it offers, what on earth do we do? Rabbi Kushner, Daniel, it's up to you.
I'll go first. Can I sit? Are we sitting or am I?
We're sitting.
We're sitting. Thank you, Mark. I'll approach this from a slightly different angle, and I know Rabbi Kushner will do the same. First of all, uncharacteristically, I wish to say just a word about my biography, because I think it actually is indicative of a lot of what the last 15 or so years of California Jewish life has been about. So you mentioned some in your introduction. So I was the founding executive director of the Progressive Jewish Alliance, which started in some founding PJAers in this room, which started in 1999 in Los Angeles. In 2005, we opened up our Bay Area office. A few years ago, I had already departed. We merged with the Jewish Funds for Justice. We are now called Ben D'Arc, with offices and presence around the country. Sort of the premier domestic Jewish social justice organization. I at that time, had the great privilege of being one of the founding board members of an antecedent that's opposed to the kitchen in IKAR, which is one of the first, if not the first, of the new generation of startup synagogues. At any minute, the rabbi of IKAR may walk through the door. She's doing a plenary in a couple of hours, Rabbi Sharon Brous, who really should be with us on this panel today as well. I got hired to come run the federation here, precisely because, perhaps alone amongst the major American Jewish communities, in San Francisco, the fact that I had been the leader for 9 years of a startup social justice organization that never received or expected to receive a penny from the central Jewish community institutions in Los Angeles was a plus, was a pro. And although that only lasted 14 months before I found my wonderful home at NIF, where I've been now for almost 5 years, I do think it's indicative of the way California thinks, right? Let's try a guy who comes from this new startup social justice universe. And now I run the New Israel Fund, and Mark, you mentioned that in the 19th century, the Bay Area was the home of Jewish conservative anti-Zionists, and now it's the home of Jewish as well as non-Jewish anti-Zionists from the hard left. But in the latter third of the last century, the Bay Area also gave birth to progressive Zionism through the New Israel Fund, which started here in 1979. So again, I think that this interesting, just 2 minutes of biography indicates the sweep of the result of the history. And we stand on a lot of shoulders here, but I do believe that, that in California, certainly over the last 15 or so years, we have been at the fore of a change that is now rolling across the country, and I'll be interested when you write your book after you write about Jimmy Carter. You write your book about that. I just want to say what I think the basic ingredients are, and this is obviously not an academic, but rather an experiential and field-based analysis. but one that has resulted from a number of years of working in those fields since 1999. What's different about California, in addition to the history that the professor just noted for us? One, distance. Distance from Israel, yes, but much more importantly, distance from New York, and distance from the East Coast Jewish establishment. And by the way, to my friends from the East Coast, I was born in Connecticut, so I have the zeal of the convert. But I intermarried in that I married a Jewish woman from California, and you know how that ends. We're here. So distance. The distance has created, at least in our generation of new progressive Jewish thinking and organizing in California, a sense of freedom from constraint, right? And that is connected directly to something that is part of the cliche, the story of California, which, of course, like all cliches, has a real kernel of truth in it. One's pedigree, where one went to college or synagogue or summer camp, matters very little in California when it comes to your ability to get something going, right? Now, we happen to, the two of us and Rabbi Brous, all came from very pedigreed East Coast kinds of places, but at least in my case, and I know in Sharon's case, and I'm guessing in yours, that had absolutely nothing to do with the organizations that we started and built here in California. And that's because if you're good at what you do, right? The flip side to the superficiality that is often ascribed to us Californians, and there may be a kernel of truth there too, although I reject it. The flip side is we really don't feel the constrictions of needing permission from anybody to innovate and to start something. And even though you'll always have people who question your right to do what you're doing, you can largely ignore them, because as long as you are good and you attract a base of support, you can build what you want to build without permission from anybody. There is no Conference of Presidents in California. The center that there is, and I say this as a guy who ran the center in this community for 14 months, the center that there is a weak center, right? That is to say, the federations and establishment organizations that are powerful in New York and in Boston and in Chicago and in many of the Midwestern and East Coast cities are weak here. I'm not suggesting by saying that they're weak that they are ineffective or inefficient. You can draw your own conclusions about that. I think that there are some terrific examples of wonderful community projects and institutions that come from the establishment both in LA and San Francisco, but they are weak. That is to say, there is a big Midwestern city where I was told when I made my first official visit as the head of New Israel Fund that I had to be careful because the head of the federation didn't want anybody raising money in his town, right? The idea that this would be the case in Los Angeles or San Francisco is laughable, right? And absurd and wonderfully, patently untrue. Now, as the professor will say, there are real downsides to having such a weak center in many, many areas. But for me, and for what I've done in my career in the communities that I feel so honored and fortunate to have been a part of building, including one with Rabbi Kushner here, that central weakness is a blessing as well as a curse. It's a curse because there's very little money for us there. Now, that's not to say that there isn't any, and I want to say that in San Francisco, the center has provided support for some of the projects I've been involved in, but there is very little expectation. When we started in LA, PJA, and later IKAR, there was no expectation, and thus no disappointment, right? We had absolutely no expectation that we would get a grant from Federation, and so there was no disappointment when that proved true, right? And so you went and you found other ways to support yourself, which brings me to the next distinction. Many of the successful versions of these startups, these innovative projects in California are strong, right? They're strong in that they have been forced to be self-sustaining. They have been forced to identify their base, and you know, it's amazing to me when I look at the funding basis for the New Israel Fund. I served on the board of the Kitchen. When I was on the board of IKAR at Progressive Jewish Alliance, they're diversified portfolios whether you like it or not. Because you are simply not going to be able to put all your eggs in one funding basket because, as we say in Hebrew, ein davar kazeh. Nothing like that exists. You don't have the option. But you're not going to be in the position of saying, oh crap, the Federation cut my grant, what am I going to do? I get all my money from them. Because you don't. Right? So that scarcity allows you to become, I believe, stronger if you're successful. And finally, I think that the sort of trends of innovation that you mentioned, there's sort of, I three quick examples. One is sort of the gold rush. Levi Strauss, our most famous Jewish resident, and for those of you who aren't San Franciscans, what's sometimes amazing to learn is that the Levi Strauss family continues to this day to be one of the most dynamic, progressive funders of Jewish life in the Bay Area, right? And beyond, but mostly in the Bay Area. There are several foundations that derive directly from the family that have supported everything I've ever had the honor of being involved in, and the things that you've been involved in too. Progressive Jewish Alliance, the Kitchen, the New Israel Fund, the new Jewish environmental movement, which is so powerful here in the Bay Area. The various foundations of the Levi Strauss family, and that's just one example, are great supporters. And that spirit of entrepreneurship, which in this case is 150 years old, and you will no doubt correctly accuse me of romanticizing all of this, and yet there is an appreciation in these foundations for this spirit of entrepreneurship and an unabashed willingness to support things that may rattle the cage or be too progressive in other places. The other two examples are Silicon Valley and Hollywood, right? So even though I think that the record of support for all of our various ventures is more mixed when it comes to these two sectors, these are the industries that today characterize California as much as any other. And they are industries that prize innovation, they prize entrepreneurship, and they encourage it. And I think that we have all benefited from that spirit as well. And last thing I'll say, and I see an old friend Eric sitting here in the room, is a willingness to work together. When Eric was the head of the Workman's Circle in Los Angeles back at the turn of the current century, and I was the director of the new startup PJA, we didn't think twice about convening a group of liberal Jewish organizations to sit at the same table. And again, it didn't occur to us that this was inappropriate or that there should be rancor or undue partisanship at this table. We collaborated with each other as much out of a sense of necessity as naivete, and I think that has benefited this movement as well.
Thank you, Daniel. Rabbi Kushner, if you would speak, please.
Sure. I want to start. I don't like microphones, so you can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't hear you.
So my daughter, I have a 7-year-old daughter, and after Hanukkah, she asked me like how many Jews there are in the world, and I gave her whatever figure we give, I don't know, it's like 0.2, or I gave her some real. I said it's a very, very, very small minority, and she just looked at me and she said, "But Mom, there were so many people at the kitchen Hanukkah party." Context is everything, right? And I think one of the things that distinguishes a life, especially in San Francisco, and I haven't lived in LA for a long time, but specifically San Francisco, is we look out and around, and the people that we see and the people that we interact with are not heterosexual Ashkenazi families with 2 kids. Right? We have what we call at the kitchen modern family. I don't even use the word interfaith at the kitchen because that would connote a Jewish person and a non-Jewish person with 2 different passionate religious views kind of battling it out. And what we really have is a lot of people who have been passionate about secular life. Right? They've had different backgrounds, but they are not really engaged in identity politics with one another. In fact, what I try to do at the kitchen is connect them to any kind of religion whatsoever. And that is very, very different from someone who grows up in a bubble where everyone sort of looks and acts like them for the most part. And so I think one of the ingredients that immediately comes to mind for what distinguishes California is urgency. Because when we look up and around, we can see that if we don't act, if we don't innovate, if we don't do things that are different, we see it sort of falling apart all around us. Right? The idea that we would be in I call it Fiddler on the Roof syndrome, right? That we would have a Fiddler on the Roof Shabbat where everybody would look the same and act the same and know the same, that's already past us. So in fact, I don't call it innovation, I call it adaptation. I also think from my personal experience, I did lead sort of an open to the community service up in Marin for my holidays for a few years. And then I went and I met with folks who came to that service. Anyone who came to that service and it was free, I said, would you like to have coffee? Let's have coffee. And I met with people from Sonoma, from some of these counties, and those folks were maybe 2 generations away from any meaningful Jewish experience, right? Maybe the fact that they had made it to High Holidays was no short of a small miracle, right? And I saw firsthand, and I feel like, first of all, every rabbi should have to sit down for coffee with everyone who comes to High Holidays. It's a fascinating and humbling experience, I would say. Starting with about half the people wouldn't even write me back, so I'm not sure what that meant. But in addition to that, I saw firsthand what if you didn't grow up with a certain kind of Jewish experience, it doesn't take long for that to really be irrelevant. It doesn't take a long time for that experience to dissipate. The modern world is a very wonderful place, and as Moshe said, we've been embraced. And so I think the question is, what do we do from this place? And that's why I like to call it, instead of innovation, I like to call it adaptation. Because when we look out and around at the reality on the ground, what do we see? We put that urgency and that sense of the Jewish. If we pretend that the Jewish community is going to continue as it's always continued, and we have a sense that that is no longer, you put it next to a real sense of optimism and confidence, right? So if this is what the community looks like, so what now? Right, my question is not, there's been a lot of dialogue around the Pew study that came out this year. And my question is, what will the next Pew study say? Well, that's on my watch, right? What will it look like in 20 years from now? And I think it's actually incumbent upon us to come up with different solutions. A lot of times we use technology metaphors in the kitchen, and we'll say, our software, the Torah, it's pretty good. It's got some bugs, but it's pretty good. It's the hardware, it's the mechanisms by which we are transmitting this meaning and this justice, connections to Israel, that is dated. And I think it's actually looking around it and reading the Pew study, it's incumbent upon us to try to figure out what are we going to do given what we've got and how precious it is, and how do we get it to more people. And I think, at my kitchen I have a board, and they, Daniel and others, they are actually, you hear a scenario where a board, or we talked about some funders, might withhold funding if you were to try different approaches. And I think because of our population at the kitchen and our success in serving them, the board actually is constantly pushing us. It's the opposite. They're saying, no, if the kitchen doesn't try doing these things, who's going to try? Let us be the research and development team for the rest of the Jewish world. Let us try something and find some solution. And I think the fact that I don't have the kind of pressure, if I fail, if we try something that is a bust, we are actually appreciated for that. And I think that's the other piece that California lends to the conversation, is this optimism and this confidence that the problem is not in the Torah per se. The problem is not in Judaism. The problem lies in how we transmit that and where we're going and how do we get there. And the idea is just like Airbnb reinvented the hotel industry and Uber is reinventing the taxi industry. How do we reinvent ourselves so that we can get more products, if you don't mind, to more people and change more lives and make more meaning? So urgency and confidence.
I have a question for each of our panelists, and then I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. And I want to start with Noah, because you opened up your talk by saying context is everything. So if context is everything, and here you are in San Francisco, could you take your project to St. Louis, to Baltimore, to Atlanta, and what lessons or what changes would you have to implement taking your project out of San Francisco?
Are you funding it? I'm just. So a couple things. One is that we just had a really interesting conversation with Sharon of IKAR and what I call startup rabbis, affectionately startup rabbis. There's now a group of us. There's 2 in New York, there's Chicago, Seattle, DC, and San Francisco. And we had sort of an under-the-radar conversation in San Diego a few weeks ago about what we might do together. And I think there is, I always say that franchising a religious experience is like franchising a kindergarten classroom. There's a lot of things that are very specific to that community. However, there are a lot of things that are infinitely translatable. We've done a lot of work in terms of our interaction with folks on the web and with thinking about strategy and branding and some of the less meaningful on the business side. But at the same time, I think the way that we're connecting to younger people, in the Jewish community, younger people would be under 55 or 60. The way that we've reached out to that population, I think would definitely transfer to other cities.
Okay, Dan, let's talk about Zionism. So you talked about, and I think it's true, that Bay Area foundations and Jewish foundations appreciate the spirit of innovation. That was something that you said. Big donors to synagogues, perhaps not so much. Or is that just a misperception on the part of pulpit rabbis in our area who say they're fearful of a free conversation in Israel within their synagogue because they're afraid of losing their donors? Donors that they would not lose if over an open-ended conversation on intermarriage, on LGBT outreach, but yes, on Israel. And could you talk a little bit about how much of that is misperception and how much is true?
Well, for those of you who were in the opening plenary, I referred to this in that session as well. You know, this is the great, I think, one of the great issues that needs to be thoroughly vetted and shown. The light of day needs to be shown on this issue because it really is. It's kind of like money in politics, right? It's like campaign finance. There is nothing that is warping our Jewish community more in the sense that the self-selected, not elected, establishment leadership of our community, much of our community, I'm not speaking about California, I'm speaking about nationally. When it comes to Zionism, when it comes to Israel, takes a line that is not the line that is supported by the majority of American Jews, and Pew is just the latest reflection of this reality, right? So, like money in politics, the funding conundrum is something that causes a huge amount of trouble, and it's not unique to the Bay Area. I will say that one of the great things about starting your own synagogue is that you can, from the get-go, tell your rabbi, you can say whatever you want. And you know, I will just, again, use Rabbi Kushner as an example. In the first year of the kitchen's life, her 3 big Israel speakers were me, Jeremy Ben-Ami, and Peter Weinhardt. And so this, I think, is indicative of a kind of freedom that doesn't exist for a lot of pulpit rabbis. The funding conundrum is, so how do you deal with it? Right? I made that little crack this morning that now I see is getting tweeted around everywhere, including by the people who are arguing with my crack, right? That when people ask me, where's our Sheldon Adelson, I say, you are all our Sheldon Adelson. But I don't mean that in a glib way, right? I had this poster in my dorm room that I'll bet 50% of you had in your dorm rooms. And it had, you know, it had the first was a cartoon, and frame 1 was a big giant fish chasing a lot of small fish, about to gobble them up. But in frame 2, all the little fish had transformed themselves into an even bigger fish collectively, and they were now chasing the big scary fish, about to gobble that fish up, and underneath it just said, organize, right? So this, again, brings me to the heart of what I would like to have us talk about in the coming months and years as California Jews, for those of us who are. And Californians who are not Jewish, who support the J Street New Israel Fund approach to Israel and the American relationship with Israel. And that is, one of the great flaws of being a liberal is that you care about a lot of things. and it's very hard to be singularly focused. And I am watching all the nodding heads, and when my wife and I sit down to do our own tzedakah, right, I'm the CEO and a board member of the New Israel Fund, but we can't just give to New Israel Fund, because the kitchen, and we've got J Street, but we've also got, in addition to those Jewish things, a host of other things that we care about. Right? We care about gun control, we care about the environment, and you all care about the same thing. And the fact is, Irving Moskowitz takes his earnings from his bingo operations in Los Angeles County, and he sends them directly to the settlement enterprise. And Sheldon Adelson, who has unlimited wealth, has said, I'll spend as much money as I can to achieve my goals. And we don't have those guys, so we have to be those guys. Now, it's not just about the money, it's about the organizing. And I told the story earlier about that interesting meeting I had as the exec here in San Francisco with 40 some odd rabbis from all these synagogues. I had a similar meeting in New York a couple of weeks ago, who are really frightened. And you want to say to them, look at you, you're all here. What are you frightened about? Speak out together. But the fact is, and if they did speak out together, right, if the rabbis of all the synagogues who feel as we do about these issues felt empowered to speak out together, not only do I think it would be easier for them to do so, but I really think it would be much harder for the 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 big donors who threaten to pull the capital campaign together, right, or threaten to walk off the board, to have that kind of leverage. If they organize and if they had their community saying, look, I don't have to agree with what my rabbi says, but I want to defend to the death my rabbi's right to say it. And even more so, I want to have a conversation, as Jeremy said at that opening plenary, right? We should make our synagogues, the most absurd thing to me, as I'm sure it is to many of you, is the fact that we have this Hillel open Hillel debate going on right now. Right? Do you all follow this, right? Because there have been too many instances where campus Hillels have refused to, or have been told not to, invite certain kinds of speakers into the mix. A group of kids have broken away at a number of very elite, mostly at this point East Coast schools, to form what they're calling the Open Hillel movement. The fact that the Jewish community is arguing about whether or not we should be able to argue about things, right, is incredible to me. And so I think where we have failed, right, is in organizing, right, to make sure that those people who are going out on a limb feel that they have backup and that we have their backs. And I think that is a place where California, because of our history of, I believe, courageous and sometimes naive innovation, can take a leading role.
And Mark, you are a scholar and an observer of American Jewish life, not just of California Jewish life, although you live here and you work here. And I'd like you to opine on to what extent do California Jews represent the future of American Judaism, American Jewish life, and to what extent are we marginal? Are our lessons and our projects marginal? Are we, as you put it to me, musicians on the Titanic?
So I'll embrace my role as a public intellectual whose job is to come here and to complicate your narrative, whatever it is. And that is, there's a difference between an activist and an academic. And where that particular line came from was a focus. I was in the Reform rabbis came to San Francisco a few years ago, and they invited me to give the keynote, and the theme was American Jewish life on the edge of the continent in San Francisco. And essentially I was supposed to address that particular question. And so then they brought me and one of my colleagues, well, I won't name only because it was a private conversation, to meet with the board of the Reform movement in Las Vegas. They said Henderson, but we were in Las Vegas because it is all a big gamble for the future. And I gave the talk to the leaders, which is, it's about opportunity. And the fact is that you are the folks who could step up, and I think, Daniel's telling all of you to get organized. And from my perspective, honestly, it's an open question. About every 25 years in the Historical Journal in American Jewish History, there has been the article which projects the day that the last American Jew will exist if current demographic patterns continue. It's called straight line theory in sociology. It's actually wrong, but we kind of have fun with this concept. So after I gave my little spiel to the board and my colleague gave his, I walked outside and I said to him, this is what we say in the community. This is what we say in our public face. Do we really believe this? Are we really on the leading edge of innovation, or are we actually, playing in the band on the Titanic? And the response that came back to me was, in fact, that in the last 30 years, intermarriage rates have been profoundly different than they have been even in all of the earlier generations before. So I know that California is more innovative because of the stress and the pressure, and I know that that gives opportunities. A career thesis I'm developing now in my work on the 1960s is the notion that culture is actually not straight line, and it actually is for Jews in relationship to the larger culture, and it may have less to do with California or less to do with Jewish text and tradition, and more to do with Rabbi Kushner's daughter, who had that observation about the world that surrounded her. As the world that surrounds the Jews becomes more religious, Jews tend to be more religious and vice versa. Synagogue affiliation rate is highest among American Jews in the South because church affiliation rate is the highest. Conversely, the West, California, and San Francisco are also lower on the religion side. So our mistake may be in only looking at the Jews and not understanding that as a fully integrated, civil, equal group post-Haskalah, our story is actually not our story at all. Our story is the story of the worlds and the cultures that surround us. And if we're looking for our guidance, let's stop looking at ourselves.
But am I allowed to? Sure. But if that's so, I mean, you kind of could arrive at the same end, right? Because as you were talking, I was thinking about walking with my daughter in Golden Gate Park the other day and saying, you see that field right there? That's where the whole, hippie 60s sit-in, love-in thing happened. And she said, what are you talking about? Right? But if San Francisco was the epicenter and the beginning of that movement, and I'm not ascribing great substantive importance to the love-in, but I do think, like, in the culture, this made a difference. And in Berkeley, right across the bay, we have the free speech movement, right? I mean, these things did sort of impact and roll across the country. So isn't the fact that there's Jewish innovation happening in a certain way here also likely to actually see it roll the same way, if your thesis is correct, the general innovation?
The question is, how would it? So in keeping with the theme of the day, which is conversations with our daughters that give us insight on life, I will say that I closed that keynote with the rabbis talking about Congregation Shar Zahav and a Siddur they wrote called Siddur Shar Zahav. It's LGBTQ community here in San Francisco. And I said, for my daughter going to Jewish day school in the Bay Area, the notion that there's a family with two moms is normative. Two dads isn't only because she doesn't happen to have two dads in her class, but as she grows up in that place, as your daughter grows up with that's real, and that's real because that's where that is. So that's the larger dominant culture. To the extent to which we in the West or in California can create those kinds of realities for those kids who are moving up, that would be great. The historical antecedent, one of my favorite books by Israel-Diaspora, At Home in America, she talks about how Brooklyn Jews were highly identified, one would say, by Judaism, even though many of them were secular socialists, never going to synagogue and were not Jewishly educated, because they lived in Jewish neighborhoods. And then I did my undergraduate thesis at Berkeley on Jews of the Gold Rush, and I made the mistake of applying her New York model to California, and arguing how great it was in the Gold Rush, not realizing that almost none of those folks had Jewish grandkids because of the demographics, because there just weren't enough Jewish people around in order to get married, in order to sustain Jewish life. So for me, it all ultimately boils down to this question of what kind of communities can we build, and now I'll give the shout out to Sue and the Jay, because one of the arguments here is that virtual communities can be the new way of sort of reinventing Israel-Diaspora's 1920s Brooklyn New Yorkers by bringing people together through technology when they can't actually exist together.
It's interesting. I want to give one last question to all panelists together. As I've been listening to this conversation, remember, we've got Shar Zahav, our great LGBT synagogue here in San Francisco, but the first gay and lesbian synagogue is in New York. And we've got Wilderness Torah and Urban Adamah here, tremendous food justice, environmental awareness organizations, and Hazon, but Hazon started in New York. And Urban Adamah comes out of Adamah from Connecticut. We had the Progressive Jewish Alliance created in Los Angeles, but I dare say progressive Jews as a body came out of the Lower East Side of New York 100 years 100 years ago, and then they all moved to California. So my question is, the innovation, we in California and in the Bay Area, we don't have a mandate on innovation, but these creative seeds flowered here, flourished here. Is that because funders are more open to it here? Is that because the Jewish community here is more eager and needs it? Or is it because the leaders of this organization perceived that California would be more open to them? And I wonder if any of you would like to take that on.
The 2 New Englanders will now speak.
Well, but we as New Englanders, as zealous converts, we're the great example. Look, I don't think, I'm certainly speaking for myself, I don't think we were thinking to ourselves, yes, this is a field that is wide open to accepting new models, so much as we felt, these things are getting traction here. And honestly, I remember the day, I mean, your point is well taken, and there was a Jewish social justice roundtable. A version of it still exists, but I remember the day I got a phone call from a woman named Cindy Greenberg, who was calling me from New York City, and she said, I'm with an organization called the Jewish Fund for Justice, and we're going to send you a check for $15,000. And I said, my 2 questions were, well, who are you and why are you doing that, right? And this is my first inkling that there was anything out there, right? So I think that that first characteristic I enumerated earlier, the idea of distance, right? There was a certain, I've used the word naivete a few times, that we didn't know what we were supposed to not be able to do. No one told us, you can't do these things. I was 30 years old when I moved here, and it never occurred to me, and no one told me, well, you just can't start a new Jewish organization. There are Jewish organizations, and you have to either, we sort of just did it. And I think that is not unique to California. I do think, however, California provides particularly fertile soil for people who want to start something fresh and new. I mean, look, the great counterexample, with all due respect, right, is Jeremy just walked in, is J Street, which starts, in Washington D.C. But Prince Tzedek V'Shalom, there were a lot of things that happened out here, as well as in New York, that percolated up to create a moment. And I would like to think, and the professor can tell me how wrong I am, but I would like to think that these endeavors, these Jewish social justice projects, these startup synagogue projects, these creative and innovative things all help build to a moment where things like J Street have more fertile soil elsewhere to grow in. But that's based on nothing other than my own sense of my own impression and what I would like to be said.
I just remember when we were starting the kitchen, and we had to do all this work with bylaws and I remember Daniel saying, he was on my founding team, saying, well, how hard can it be? Like, it's fine, don't worry about it. And of course, like, I was cursing him, the weeks and months that followed.
That's still
right, yes. But I have a slightly different take on it, which is I think it is less geographically based and more of a moment. I think we're seeing more of a shift. I mean, I have a confession to make, which is that I had never heard of the Council of Jewish Presidents before this all happened.
You don't even know what it's called now.
I don't even know. I don't.
Doesn't
right?
matter. Doesn't matter.
But I think that's exactly my point. I was going to ask somebody, like, what is it really called? But these questions, these smaller positions of jockeying for power are just simply irrelevant in the face of my daily experience with working with the community that is here. They're simply irrelevant. And so again, I go back to this sense of urgency and optimism that I think characterizes the people here. But I know that I share that. I don't know if I share the same urgency, because I think that day-to-day the day-to-day experiences are slightly different in places like Chicago or New York. But at the same time, I know that I share this kind of optimism and confidence with my colleagues and my comrades around the country, and it tends to be more generationally segmented versus geographic.
Last, we engage in hopeless reductionism, which is what happens after you teach the survey course for too many years. It just doesn't get as complicated as it once was. So in 90 minutes, when we're supposed to talk about innovation in California, we're going to focus on that. There's a really good question to bring us back to New York. New York is the demographic organizational center of Jewish life in this country, if not in many regards of the world. And I don't really think that we can actually, even here in California, try to make any kind of claims that are going to create a duality. Everything's happening in New York because it is New York. That said, my larger argument is that culture, local culture, is defined by local culture around it, and in that California may be offering something different only because of all of the things which my colleagues have been expressing. And I'm imagining a lot of that's going to happen in New York anyway. And ultimately, we don't need to not have it happen in New York in order to affirm what it is that makes things more possible here.
We only have about 5 minutes for questions, so what I might ask is 1, 2 hand, 3 hand, 4 hand. That's it. Ask your questions, and the panelists can take which ones they want. How about that? Yes?
I have a slightly different take because nobody mentioned it. I'm also a transplant from the Adamah, I think, earlier than you guys. And the question I have is, you haven't mentioned the drive which caused me to change once I arrived here, and that was, I left behind a sense of community. And when I came here, the first thing I did was start to build community, as you people have done. And that is a driving force that underlies this, because it's so much missing in modern society. Is that true from your perspective or not?
Let's get all the questions. So the drive to rebuild a community, sense of community left behind. Sir.
First of all, a correction to Mark. The Sheriff Israel stained glass window was because they believed that that God was calling out, "Yo, Semite!" But that kind of leads to my question, which is, in the early part of the, even the end of the 19th century, but certainly in the 20th century, Israel was considered a beacon for innovation, and particularly not just Zionist, but socialist Zionist innovation. And in a certain way, it seems like that the right wing rarely comes up with new ideas. They are conservative by definition, or even farther right than conservative. A few years ago, I went to a Limud session, and one of the panels was on the future of Judaism. And someone asked after a panel like this, I think it was a rabbi, no one mentioned Israel. What's the future of Judaism without Israel? And people looked at each other and they kind of said, gee, we don't really think about Israel much in terms of the future of Judaism. So is California, in a sense, or this startup community, kind of the new Zion that the old Zion used to be?
Yes, sir.
Issue that I brought up with Daniel at the break, which is this: you don't have to be Jewish to have standing in the issues of two-state that J Street is offering up, which I think is great. About a month ago, 2 months ago, I organized a gathering. I know I'll be quick, okay? Of friends and family in our house. We sent out 100 invitations. 60 people showed up. I wanted to introduce them to J Street. Gordon Gladstone from Communal came and spoke. I thought it was a very good session. And in this group, which were maybe 20% Jewish, the rest of them were lawyers, doctors, Indian chiefs, and developers like me. We want to get involved in J Street. We think that there is standing for everybody. We see kind of a Barbara Tuchman possibility here. There'll be some accidents when all the land is gone and there's nothing to negotiate. And let me get back to California innovation. It seems to me that J Street in California can take the lead on this. We are an innovative state. It matters more what your ideas are, not where you went to school. So J Street, California, it seems to me, has an opportunity to take some leads here, because I don't think it'll be that big in New York. So could you comment on this sort of bi-coastal issue and J Street as an innovator, particularly in California, as to outreaching to non-Jews? Long question.
Last question here in the front, yes.
For progressive Jewish Californians involved with J Street, how do we even approach and look at the growing ultra-Orthodox and Chabad community in California? That has been said several morning.
All right, so we have about 3 minutes for any reaction to the sense of community left behind as a driving force in California Jewish innovation. Is California the new Zion? J Street, outreach to non-Jews, potential opportunity, and what about the ultra-Orthodox?
Yes, no?
I would love, the kitchen is involved in trying to create a Chabad-like model for progressive Jews. We would like to see Shabbat dinners across the city. We would like to have a truck. We would like to have a pop-up shop. I'm completely serious. And we'd like to meet people where they're at. I think this sort of ties back into community, and it also, bonus, ties into Judaism and Israel. I think that if religion is 80% social, Judaism is 80% social, we ignore that at our peril. We are building communities. Akiva Tor, the Council General, came to the kitchen as one of his last things. I said, why don't you come to this little startup community? And he said, because if we're going to care about Israel, we have to care about our Jewish communities. They go hand in hand. And Israel is the material expression of these beautiful ideals, right? And if our people are coming in for Shabbat, but they are not connecting to Israel, I see that as a knock on my reputation, right? They have to be connected, because you can't back away from some of the tougher issues when it gets into a materialization, when it gets into the specifics. So we have to be able to talk about Israel, but in order to do that in a meaningful way, we have to have a shared vocabulary and we have to have a shared community, and that's why we're going in this direction.
Thank you to the panelists for their really excellent presentations. Thank you for your attention. And lunch will be served